everybody, and welcome to another not quite episode of the Best Games period. It's not technically an episode. This week we're just going to call it an honorable mention. It's been a little bit since we've had one of these because we've just been putting out pretty consistent episodes. But in case you're unfamiliar, you're a new listener, honorable mentions are where, for whatever reason, one or the other of us, hosting the show can't do it, and we're just left to have a solo episode. Honorable mentions are where we just kind of talk about games that we really, really like, but aren't necessarily super great or don't hold up as one of the best games, period, or you can't make a really good case for it being the best game. Some previous examples of that being games like Overblood. I did an episode on Super Godzilla. I think there was an episode once upon a time about oh gosh, what was it about? Anyway, we've had a number. The point being, we've had a number of episodes where no one's gonna make the argument that Super Godzilla is one of the greatest games of all time, unless you really twist the criteria of greatest games of all time, which I believe I did in mine. Just in my honorable mention episode, I was like, well, you could consider it one of the best games of all time, considering there aren't any other games like it. But that's not really what this type of episode is for. So, all of that being said, usually on this show, we nominate a game every week to just kind of talk about and discuss the things that make it great. And then at the end of the episode, kind of the conceit is that we are like, hey, this is one of the best games of all time. Or, it belongs in video game canon. Which, that is all arbitrary stuff. It doesn't matter, but it's fun to think about. It's fun to talk about it. And so we add it to have a little bit of a signature to the show. And in general, this is supposed to be a positive experience, although occasionally we detour into dunking on the not so great things about video games, which, let's be real, that happens in games. So this week, I just wanted to talk about a game that I've kind of wanted to talk about for a really long time on this show. It's not really a game I could ever talk about on the main show. I think Naomi would agree with me. It is Star Wars Episode 1, Racer. And for the longest time, I thought it was just called Star Wars Episode 1 Podracer. And when I actually went to make sure I had my facts mostly straight for this show, I found out that it's not actually called Podracer. It's just called Racer. And that is for a very good reason. Being that when they went to trademark the name for the game, turns out that there were other games that had trademarked things with pod in it. Just the word pod, in the names of their games. And so they decided to drop the pod racer and just go with racer, which seems odd, but you know what? I'm not a legal scientist, I believe is the technical term for it. So, let it be. That being said, I'm here to talk about Star Wars Episode 1, Racer. I just realized that might sound weird. I just want you to know that there's a like a punctuation colon in the name, not you would just pronounce it Star Wars Episode 1 Racer. I just realized it sounded very strange when you say Racer. Oh, goodness gracious. I'm glad I don't have a co-host to berate me for that until maybe she listens to it. Who knows? We'll find out. Anyway, I'm your host, Jack Gardner, and this week we're going to be talking about that game, the one I just mentioned. So it's really hard to describe the kind of climate that this game released in, because it released in 1999, fairly close on the heels of the release of Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, which was... It's really hard to understate... To overstate? It's hard to overstate how primed and excited the entire world was for Star Wars Episode 1 in the lead up. People were going bananas. I remember even as a little kid, I was going bananas because my entire life up to that point, one of the things that I really bonded with like my family and my brother over were the original trilogy, and all of a sudden we were going to have a new Star Wars. And to me, looking back on Star Wars as, being a little kid, like the little kid reference is like anything that happened before you were born was like an eternity ago. So when I was a kid, it seemed like there had been just a colossal gap. Like in my head, you might as well have said like, oh yeah, Star Wars came out in the 1920s, and it's been 80 years, and we're about to get a new Star Wars film. And that's not obviously the case, but to me, that's what it seemed like. And it all reached a fever pitch, and I remember going to see it in the theater, and I remember walking out and just thinking like, that was really exciting. That was really cool. And, I didn't get to see it again until it came out on I think VHS. We rented it on VHS because back in those days you could actually rent films at stores, and they came on these brick-like things filled with tape, and you put them into another brick-like machine, and it would create a film on your television screen. And the experience of kind of watching it again, I think, was the first time I realized, I can't really articulate it. I can't put words to this thing that I'm feeling, but this isn't. This movie could be better. It's not a masterpiece, and I realize that sometimes things are relative to your mindset when you experience them, because getting swept up in the fever pitch of excitement for Star Wars Episode 1 really shifted what I had experienced, and I think that's true for a lot of people, actually. Like, looking back now, it's easy to say, oh yeah, Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, was a subpar science fiction movie. But at the time, you could find people who were adamant that it was a work of genius, and that, people just didn't understand it. And, oh my gosh, the music and the choreography, the fighting. And let's be real, there are a lot of things to actually like about Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. It is a pretty gorgeous looking movie. There are some really amazing shots. There are some interesting ideas. The choreography and the fighting is pretty interesting compared to what we had seen in Star Wars previously, which treated the lightsaber more as like a broadsword rather than kind of a weapon made out of light. And so it just kind of recontextualized a lot of the Star Wars universe. And I don't want it to sound like I think it's a great movie, because I don't. It's not a great movie, but there are things in there to like. And I think right when the movie came out, people latched onto those things like they were life preservers. Those were the things that people were huddling around for warmth in kind of the dark, encroaching coldness of the realization that Star Wars was going down a dark path, and not in a good dramatic narrative way, but in a, oh no, this is not good kind of way. And I would argue that possibly the best thing to come out of the Star Wars prequels was Star Wars Episode 1 Racer. because this game is objectively really good. I think it is. Like, it certainly has problems, but compared to its source material, compared to the overall Phantom Menace, this is a solid racing game. And actually, to this day, I believe it holds the world record for best-selling science fiction racing game. So you can take your F-Zeros and your, Loco Cycles, and you can stick them where the sun don't shine, because Star Wars Episode 1 Racer outsold them all. Like 3.2 million copies, which is, that's a lot. That's a lot for a racing game based on sci-fi stuff. Those typically don't do super well, but this one did. And I think I know why. It is incredibly well put together, and it takes one of the most interesting and kinetic scenes from Phantom Menace, the pod racing scene, and expands on it and allowed people to kind of live that fantasy, that particular part of the fantasy, which was never really explored again in any of the Star Wars films. You could kind of say it was maybe in the opening of Attack of the Clones, but let's not talk about that movie because it's really the worst one of the three. The whole point being that Racer allowed people to jump into the cockpits of these pod racers and kind of live out that Anakin Skywalker high-speed racing fantasy. And it did that very well. It's a racer that demands a lot of precision from players, and it also demands a certain amount of system management, which isn't typical of a racing game. And I think that's what gives Racer a little bit of that spice, that spicy meatball that makes it so interesting, because the central conceit is that you are racing and you're obviously going around a track and you're on these alien worlds, which, that's interesting by itself. Like a lot of these different locations. And I believe, fun fact, they were given access to the map of the Tatooine race. Not Tatooine. Tatooine. The Tatooine race. So that is all accurate to the film, which, that's pretty neat, I guess. And you have to manage your engines, because you go pretty fast just normally when you're holding down the acceleration stuff. But wow, this is a really technical podcast. I don't know if you can handle it. It requires a high IQ to follow what I'm saying. The point being that when you boost your pod racer, which you can do at almost any time, you just have to have built up enough speed, that puts your engines into kind of this hyper mode that can quickly lead to overheating your engines. And once that happens, you're going to start having problems. You can only go so far on overheated engines until they burst into flame, or until you hit something and they explode, which they will do much more easily when you're going faster. So there was kind of this element of riding the line. And what I mean by that is, seeing how fast you could go for how long and without exploding. Like, there was this kind of adrenaline rush, because there wasn't that much out there that could simulate this kind of speed. I mean, I believe the developers were basically aiming for like 600-ish miles per hour as the speed that they were simulating. That is hard to do, but I think they nailed it with a lot of the visual blur and the way that things kind of come at you so fast that you're kind of white knuckle driving. You're trying to kind of keep control of this uncontrollable vehicle, while you're also pitted against the clock and these other racers, and there are just all these variables that you're managing, and that makes it fun. That makes it feel like an accomplishment when you won, because you had to ride that line. You had to push yourself right up to the point where you were about to explode in order to win. And that's just cool. Like, objectively, I think that is objectively the thing you want to do in a racing game. Now, granted, a lot of this was constrained by the hardware of the time, and I don't think that visually this game doesn't have a ton of strong suits. There are a couple places that look pretty good, like the opening Tatooine level, that racetrack. And I think part of that is they were given access to some of Lucasfilm's assets for the actual movie, and that's how they got kind of a higher visual quality for that particular area. But kind of down the road, as you're going to these other planets, they're going off the grid. They were making areas and environments that had never really been in a Star Wars game before, hadn't really been depicted visually in Star Wars. And so there's a lot of freedom to that, but there's also, you're constrained by 1999 graphics. You have to be able to fit this thing on an N64 cartridge. One of the things that they actually ran into a problem with, they were going to have some kind of online component to Star Wars Racer, but it ended up being scrapped in favor of lands because it was basically just too hard for the amount of time that they had to get this game out. They couldn't do it. So this thing kind of released right in the middle of all this fervor and this hype, and people flocked to it. I think that's a large reason why it managed to reach that 3.2 million copies sold number. They managed to kind of set that record that hasn't, to this day, has not been surpassed by a sci-fi racing game. And it just rode the wave of expectations, but also this was a great game to just kind of sit down and play with. And I mean that less in a play with it how the developers intended sense, and more in the developers, they didn't really give you tools, but you could do things with other players in game. If you had it on PC, you could LAN up to 8 other PCs together and race in this game. Or if you were on console, you could get 2 players together in split screen. And one of the things I would do with my friends, I don't know if this is something that was like widespread or anything like that. This is just anecdotal. And again, a lot of the reason why I'm talking about this game today is just because anecdotally I like this game. We would joust. We'd call it jousting. And the idea was you would find a flat stretch of track on one of the maps, and then you would try and boost at each other and blow up one of the other's engines while driving at each other head on, and the goal was to survive, which I believe you could do. It was difficult and crazy hard, but we found ways to do it, is what I'm saying. Most of the time it just resulted in misses or fiery, fireballs and crashing and all that jazz, but this was just kind of the kind of game where you wanted to play around. There were hidden shortcuts on different levels, and trying to find all of those and figure out the best routes through some of these stages, especially the later ones, which got crazy hard. Figuring out all of those shortcuts and special routes and tricks, that was fun. It felt like a puzzle game sometimes almost, but it was still this racing game. And it allowed you to do some of the signature tricks from the Phantom Menace. You could tilt your podracer, do a 180 and kind of, not a 180, a 90. You could tilt your racer at a 90-degree angle is what I'm trying to say. And like, so you'd be basically flying vertically. That was always fun. It was just kind of this old school sensibility of speed, but applied to this new technology, this crazy 3D racing world. And I don't think that anything has really ever approached it again in terms of being both accessible and fast. I mean, when I think of another fast sci-fi racing game, I think of the F-Zero GX, which came out on the Nintendo GameCube. And that game was crazy fast, man. Like, whoa, pull them over and give them a citation, officer, because they're going too fast. But it was also really hard to control and really hard to kind of feel like you were making progress and getting better at playing the game. Whereas, Star Wars Episode 1 Racer, you felt like you were going fast and you had some modicum of control over how well you were doing. Like, when you lost, it usually felt fair. I'm not going to say it always felt fair. But you got that sense. And you would have arguments between friends about, oh, who's your favorite racer? Oh, they're trash, like whatever. One thing I remember very vividly about playing this game is that no one really wanted to play any of the characters from the movies. No one really wanted to be Sebulba. A couple people wanted to be Anakin, I guess, but like for me personally, I really liked playing Mars Guo, which I didn't know at the time, but in the movie is the character that Sebulba sabotages in the race. He like throws a chunk of his podracer into Mars Guo's engine and it explodes. Yeah, didn't know that, but again, as with most Star Wars things, you can go onto like Wikipedia and read up like full-on novels about the history of any character that is remotely connected to any of the Star Wars films. And the characters of Star Wars Episode 1 Racer are no exception. Let me just say that. They are not an exception to that rule in the slightest. But yeah. Also, on that note, things get real weird when you're reading about the characters that were on Tatooine, because they all have like some connection with like slavery, it seems like, because Tatooine had slaves on it, and that gets pretty weird when you're reading about these alien creatures with stupid names buying and selling each other or whatever. Like, even if it's for like, oh, I fell in love with this enslaved character, I will buy them and then we will be together. Like, that's still pretty creepy. Not a good thing. Don't do that, kids. Anyway, basically what I'm trying to get at is that Star Wars Episode 1 Racer was incredibly accessible, was incredibly fun, because it gave you the feeling of control while also getting you to go fast. And there was this kind of emphasis on micromanaging your engines, because you had to, while you were racing, you had to repair them. You had to keep them cool, and you could flood them with coolant, but then you would have to go slow, and you wouldn't be able to boost for a while. But then you could boost longer, but if you boosted too long, you would start damaging your engines, and that could potentially put them on fire, and then they would explode, or you would just, it would be a bad day if they were on fire. As with most things that you own, if they're on fire, that's going to be a bad day, probably. So, yeah, I'm kind of running out of things to talk about with this game. I didn't have a whole lot planned. I believe I will be adding... So, just talking a little inside baseball with you. Naomi is out of town in Iceland. She took a vacation, a much earned and much needed vacation following E3, but she'll be back hopefully next week. We'll see. And on that note, we did just get back from E3, so I've seen a whole bunch of things that I am currently in the process of writing about. Naomi, when she gets back, she's also going to be writing about that stuff that we saw. We'll probably also talk about it on more in depth on a podcast, maybe give like our best games of E3 or something along those lines. There are a bunch of really cool games coming out, guys. I think I'll take just an opportunity real quick to do a little shout out for a game I got some hands-on time with called Black Future 88, which is this alternate reality where World War III broke out and nuclear war happened and humanity is kind of in shambles and people will have radiation sickness and there are mutants and zombies and all kinds of stuff, and it's a side-scrolling shooter with the premise being that your character has just learned that they have 18 minutes to live until their heart explodes, and they have decided that they are going to take revenge on the evil corporation that did this to them. And in order to do that, they have to go to the corporate tower and kind of climb it and kill a bunch of, military and zombies and all kinds of bad guys in there. It is pretty cool. And one of the things I really dug about it is you can actually use your own time as currency. So if you have 16 minutes to live, you might be able to spend a minute of that and get some really cool piece of gear. Alternatively, you might find a power-up in the tower that gives you an extra minute or two to live. And there are also other little trade-offs that you're constantly having to manage and think about. One of those being that you can go to the basement of the tower instead of going up to the top and taking it floor by floor. If you go to the basement, you can actually skip an entire floor, but it's full of really roided up monsters and powerful dudes. And then at the end of that, you have to fight in the Murder Vader, which is an elevator full of murder, which is pretty great. Another thing I really liked about it is it has a heavy emphasis on mobility, so you have a dash that can kind of take you through different platforms and get you out of the way of projectiles. But you will also find other things and level up as you progress, and you can put different effects on your dash. For example, maybe making it do damage, giving you the ability to dash twice. Or you can find new weapons that allow you to shoot in various patterns. One of the cool things that I found during the demo that I had was this railgun where you shoot it and you swap places with any enemy that you hit with it, which was pretty fun. I was able to use that to just completely obliterate the boss of the level who had this really nasty dashing attack, and I would just swap places with them and they would not be able to hit me because I was on the other side of them. It was pretty great. And just interesting mobility mechanics like that make Black Future 88 interesting. And now it's very much a roguelike type game, so every time you play it, it's going to be a little bit different. The floors are all going to be a little different. I'm not sure if the bosses are going to be different. I never got to ask that. But it is very fun. I enjoyed it quite a bit, and I think it's one of those little indie games that deserves a shout-out. I hope it does really well. And I'm going to be writing more about that. You can find that on the Extra Life website, where Naomi and I will be writing about our experiences, as well as Zach and Marcus. You might recognize Zach and Marcus from the podcasts that have been going up on our official channel, which we just needed a place to host them, so that's why they're there. They're not official episodes, and they're also there to remind you that that's what we were doing. We weren't, just lollygagging around out at E3. We were actually seeing stuff. And, so you can find all of that over on community.extra-life.org. And on top of that, we used to say when we closed out the episode, you can find this podcast over on GameInformer.com. That is no longer the case, just because the Game Informer user blog section where I used to be featured as a community blogger on the front page of the website, that has been scrapped, but might be coming back in some form or fashion. So for now, we're not going to say that you can find us on GameInformer.com, although I think you can find a lot of the archives of the episodes we did post on there. In the meantime, you can always find us on Extra Life. You can always find us on SoundCloud and Libsyn and iTunes and all those other podcasty hosting places. And on top of that, we also have a Patreon, which is, we always appreciate it when people support us on Patreon. Even if you support us for only $1 per month, we occasionally throw up special episodes that are only accessible to our patrons, and those are just like kind of our little thank yous for giving us your time when you listen to the episodes, and also a little bit of money to help us keep the podcast going and content pumping. So we always really appreciate that. We also appreciate it if anyone leaves us reviews. That is always helpful, and we always appreciate the feedback. I was going to talk about a couple other games today, but I was not prepared. So I ended up talking about Star Wars Episode 1 Racer. Not to be confused with Star Wars Episode 1 Racer. That's a very different game. I believe a couple of the games that were floated for tonight were games like Borderlands 2, Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening, Until Dawn. Those are 3 games that do not deserve honorable mentions. They deserve entire episodes on their own, in my opinion. And that's I think we should do those. That I've been intending to do an Until Dawn episode for quite some time, but I couldn't do it alone. I needed my Naomi. Maybe we can pull in a guest or two. We made a lot of connections during E3, so hopefully we can grab a couple people we met on the road, and you'll be seeing them on the podcast in the near future. All of that being said, I think that's it. So I'll be seeing you all next week on the Flippity Dippity.